The night was cold in Brooklyn, but inside Club Neon, the air was thick with heat, expensive cologne, and the electric pulse of ambition. It was a Friday in late October, and the venue was packed wall to wall with New York's newest royalty, not politicians or businessmen, but influencers. Young men and women in designer clothes, phones perpetually raised, documenting every second of their manufactured lives for audiences of millions who watched, liked and worshipped from behind glowing screens. The club throbbed with bass-heavy music, strobe lights cutting through clouds of vape smoke. At the center of it all, the VIP section gleamed like a shrine to excess. Crystal bottles of champagne lined the tables, each costing more than most people's monthly rent. The influencers moved through the space like peacocks, posing, laughing too loudly, their eyes constantly scanning for the next viral moment. But in the far corner, away from the lights and cameras, sat a man who didn't belong to this new world. Luca Rinaldi occupied a small booth near the back exit, a place where shadows gathered and the music felt distant. He was 73 years old, though his eyes held centuries of stories. His grey hair was combed back neatly, his suit simple but impeccably tailored, dark wool, no flash, nothing that screamed for attention. On the table before him sat a single glass of red wine, barely touched. Luca had come to Brooklyn 15 years ago, leaving behind a life that most people only saw in movies. In Naples, his name had meant something. It meant power. It meant respect earned through blood, strategy, and an iron will that bent entire neighborhoods to his word. He had been a boss in the Camorra, one of Italy's most dangerous criminal organizations. But that was another life, another continent, another version of himself he'd tried to bury. Now, he ran a small Italian restaurant in Bay Ridge, a quiet place where old men played cards and families gathered on Sundays. He had grandchildren he saw on holidays. He attended Mass. He fed stray cats in the alley behind his building. The violence, the territory wars, the bodies, all of it was supposed to be behind him. But men like Luca never truly escape their past. It follows them like a shadow, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Tonight, that moment was walking through the door. Tessa Marino was 24 years old and already a millionaire. With 7 million followers on Instagram, 3 million on TikTok, and a growing YouTube channel, she had built an empire on her looks, her attitude, and her willingness to do anything for content. She wore a skin-tight red dress that caught every light in the room, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her lips painted the color of danger. Behind her, a videographer followed with a professional camera, capturing her every move. Tessa thrived on attention, but more than that, she thrived on chaos. Her brand was built on crossing lines, testing boundaries, making headlines. She'd crashed celebrity parties, confronted famous athletes, staged public pranks that sometimes bordered on cruel, and her audience loved her for it. They loved watching someone do what they couldn't, say what they wouldn't, push until something broke. Tonight, she was live streaming. Her phone was held high, angled perfectly to capture her face and the club behind her. Thousands of viewers were already watching, their comments flooding the screen in real time. One comment caught her eye, repeated by dozens of users. "Tess the old man in the corner. They say he's a legend." Tessa's eyes scanned the club until they landed on Luca. She tilted her head, intrigued. The old man looked out of place, too calm, too quiet. Her followers were feeding her information through the comments. Someone claimed he was connected, that people in the neighborhood whispered his name with a strange mix of fear and reverence. Perfect. Tessa turned to her videographer and nodded. This was the content. This was the moment that would go viral. She approached Luca's booth slowly, deliberately. Her phone still recording. The crowd around her began to notice, conversations dropping off, heads turning. The music seemed to dim, though it hadn't changed. Something in the air shifted, a primal instinct warning that a line was about to be crossed. Luca didn't look up. He had noticed her the moment she entered the club. He noticed everyone. Decades of survival had trained him to read rooms, to sense danger before it arrived. He knew what she was, what she wanted, and he knew she was making a mistake. Tessa stopped at the edge of his booth, her phone pointed directly at him. Her voice was bright, mocking, designed for the camera. She asked if he was the legend people whispered about, if he was the old dog everyone pretended to fear. Her tone dripped with condescension, the kind of arrogance that comes from never facing real consequences. Luca slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. There was no anger in his gaze, no threat, just a deep, ancient weariness. He had seen 1,000 Tessas in his life. People who mistook cruelty for strength, who thought power was something you performed. What happened next occurred in less than 2 seconds, but it would reshape both of their lives forever. Tessa leaned in, her face inches from Luca's, and slapped him across the face. The sound cracked through the club like a gunshot. Conversations stopped. The music continued, but it felt like silence. Every eye in the room turned toward the corner booth. Luca's head had barely moved from the impact. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, where Tessa's ring had caught his lip. He sat perfectly still, his expression unchanged, and then slowly the room began to react. The 40 men scattered throughout the club. Men who had been drinking, laughing, pretending to be just another part of the crowd, all stopped what they were doing. They didn't rush forward. They didn't shout. They simply stood, their bodies' language shifting from casual to something far more dangerous. These were Luca's men, the remnants of his old crew, the ones who had followed him from Naples and never truly let go of the old ways. Tessa's smile faltered. Her phone wavered slightly. For the first time, she felt the weight of what she'd done. Luca reached up with one hand and touched the blood on his lip. He examined it for a moment, then slowly stood. He was not a tall man, but in that moment he seemed to tower over everything in the room. He looked at Tessa, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded life and death. He called her a child, and told her she had just woken the wolves. Then he turned and walked toward the back exit, his steps measured, unhurried. The 40 men began to move, surrounding Tessa and her videographer. They didn't touch her. Not yet. They simply closed in, a wall of silence and menace. Within minutes, every phone in that club was confiscated. Every video, every photo, every live stream erased. The bouncers, who were on Luca's payroll, locked the doors. No one was leaving until this was handled. Tessa's live stream had cut off mid-broadcast. Her followers would spend the next hours flooding her accounts with messages, demanding to know what happened. But there would be no answer, because Tessa Marino had just disappeared. Chapter 2. The Lesson. When Tessa woke, she didn't know where she was. The room was dark, windowless, the walls bare concrete. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. She was sitting in a metal chair, her hands bound behind her back with zip ties that cut into her wrists. Her head throbbed. Someone had sedated her, she realized. The last thing she remembered was the men closing in, a hand over her mouth, and then nothing. Panic seized her chest. She tried to scream, but her throat was raw, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled against the restraints, but they held firm. Time passed. Minutes, hours, she couldn't tell. There was no clock, no sound, except the hum of the bulb overhead. Her mind raced through every horror story she'd ever heard, every warning her mother had given her about pushing too far, crossing the wrong people. Then the door opened. Luca Rinaldi entered alone. He looked exactly as he had in the club, calm, composed, his suit still perfect. He carried a wooden chair, which he placed a few feet in front of her, and sat down slowly, his movements deliberate. For a long moment he simply looked at her. Not with anger, not with cruelty, with something worse, disappointment. He began to speak, his voice low and measured. He told her that she reminded him of someone he once knew, a young man in Naples who thought respect was something you could ignore, that power was a game. That young man had died badly, Luca said, and it had been a waste. Tessa's breathing was shallow, her eyes wide. She wanted to beg, to apologize, but something in Luca's presence silenced her. He explained that she had grown up in a world where actions didn't have consequences, where everything was content, where shame and fear were just emotions you performed for views. But that world, he said, was an illusion. Underneath the cameras and the likes, the real world still operated by older, harsher rules, rules that didn't care about followers or fame. He stood and walked around her slowly, his footsteps echoing. He told her about respect, not the kind you demanded, but the kind you earned. He spoke of his own past, of the mistakes he'd made, the lives he'd taken, the weight he carried every day. He didn't speak with pride or regret, just with the flat honesty of someone who had seen too much. Then he stopped in front of her and said something that chilled her to the bone. He told her that he could make her disappear. Completely. No body would ever be found. No trace would ever surface. Her millions of followers would mourn her, create conspiracy theories, move on to the next tragedy. In 6 months she would be a memory. In a year, forgotten. Tessa's entire body shook. Tears streamed down her face, smudging her makeup, the carefully constructed image she presented to the world, dissolving into raw, terrified humanity. But Luca didn't kill her. Instead, he did something far more deliberate. He left her in that room for 3 days. 3 days of silence, 3 days of darkness, broken only by that single bulb. Food and water were brought by men who never spoke, who never met her eyes. She was given a bucket for a bathroom, a thin blanket against the cold. No phone, no contact, no reassurance that she would ever leave. On the first day, she screamed until her voice gave out. On the second day, she cried until there were no tears left. On the third day, she simply sat in silence, staring at the concrete walls, and thought about her life. She thought about her childhood in Queens, the daughter of Italian immigrants who worked brutal hours to give her opportunities. She thought about how she'd built her brand on humiliation and spectacle, how she'd traded dignity for engagement, how she'd become addicted to the validation of strangers. She thought about the moment she'd slapped Luca, the thrill of it, the certainty that she was untouchable, and she realized with brutal clarity that she had been a fool. On the 4th morning, the door opened again. Luca entered, followed by 2 of his men. They cut her restraints and helped her stand. Her legs barely worked after 3 days in the chair. Luca handed her a phone, not hers, a new one, with a single video file already loaded. He told her to record a message. No script, no performance, just the truth. Tessa's hands trembled as she held the phone. She looked at Luca, searching for mercy, for guidance. He offered neither. He simply waited. She pressed record. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, broken, stripped of all the manufactured confidence that had defined her brand. She said that respect was not a trend, not a game, not something you could fake. She said that she had made a terrible mistake, that she had hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and that she had learned the hardest lesson of her life. She said that survival required more than followers. It required humility, wisdom, and the understanding that actions had consequences. When she finished, Luca took the phone back. He told her that the video would be posted, but not by her. It would appear on her accounts in a way that couldn't be traced, couldn't be deleted. Then he told her she was free to go. Tessa stared at him, disbelieving. She asked, her voice barely a whisper, why he was letting her live. Luca looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she would never forget. He told her that death was easy. Living with the weight of your mistakes, that was the real punishment. Chapter 3. The Aftermath. Tessa Marino reappeared on social media 4 days after the incident at Club Neon. No explanation, no dramatic reveal, just a single video posted simultaneously across all her platforms at 3 in the morning. In the video, she looked nothing like the polished influencer millions knew. Her face was bare of makeup, her hair pulled back simply, her eyes red and exhausted. She sat in what appeared to be a modest hotel room, the lighting harsh and unflattering. Everything about the video screamed authenticity in a way her carefully curated content never had. The message she delivered was the one Luca had recorded. But watching it, viewers couldn't tell if it was scripted or spontaneous. It felt real because it was. Within hours, the video had 10 million views. Within a day, 50 million. The internet exploded with theories, reactions, debates. Some followers praised her for the raw honesty, calling it her most powerful content ever. Others accused her of staging an elaborate stunt. Conspiracy theorists claimed she'd been kidnapped, that the video was recorded under duress, that powerful forces were controlling her. But what shocked everyone most was what happened next. Tessa didn't engage with any of it. She didn't post follow-ups, didn't explain, didn't try to capitalize on the viral moment. Her accounts went silent. Behind the scenes, her life was unraveling in ways the public couldn't see. Her agent called 17 times in the first 24 hours. Brand deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were suddenly under review. A cosmetics company that had been negotiating a partnership pulled out completely, citing concerns about her brand image. Fellow influencers, sensing blood in the water, began distancing themselves, unfollowing her, subtly suggesting in their own content that she'd gone too far this time. Tessa sat in her apartment in Manhattan, an expensive high-rise she'd rented to project success, and watched her empire crack. But something inside her had fundamentally changed. The validation she'd spent years chasing suddenly felt hollow. The numbers that had once defined her worth now seemed meaningless. She thought constantly about those 3 days in the darkness, not with anger or resentment, but with something approaching understanding. Luca hadn't tortured her physically. He'd forced her to confront something far more painful, herself. Meanwhile, in Bay Ridge, Luca Rinaldi returned to his routine as if nothing had happened. He opened his restaurant every morning at 10. He supervised the kitchen, greeted regular customers by name, poured wine for old men who played cards at the corner table. To anyone watching, he was just a retired grandfather, a remnant of an older New York that was slowly disappearing. But those who knew better understood that something had shifted. Word of what happened at Club Neon had spread through certain circles. Not the influencer world, but the older, quieter network of men who remembered when Brooklyn was governed by different rules. The story became legend almost immediately. An influencer had slapped Don Rinaldi and lived to tell about it, but not in the way she'd wanted. The message was clear. The old man had shown mercy, but that mercy was itself a demonstration of power. He could have erased her. Instead, he'd educated her. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone that there were still lines you didn't cross, still men you didn't disrespect. Luca never spoke about it. When asked by the few people who dared bring it up, he would simply change the subject or offer a slight smile that revealed nothing. But his crew, the 40 men who had been present that night, understood the deeper lesson. Their boss had shown restraint when he could have shown violence. He'd chosen psychology over brutality, a long game over immediate satisfaction. It was a masterclass in power, and they respected him for it even more than if he'd handled it the old way. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the incident, Luca was in his restaurant when an unexpected visitor arrived. Tessa Marino walked through the door. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair down, no makeup, no camera. She looked younger somehow, more human, stripped of the armor she'd worn for so long. The restaurant went quiet as she entered, several regular customers recognizing her immediately. She walked straight to Luca, who was wiping down a table near the kitchen. He looked up, unsurprised. He'd anticipated this moment. Tessa spoke quietly, her voice steady but laced with emotion. She thanked him for not killing her, which drew a small, almost sad smile from the old man. Then she said something that surprised him. She asked if she could work for him, not for content, not for a story, but genuinely. She said she needed to learn how to be a person again, how to exist without the performance. She offered to work in the kitchen, to clean tables, to do anything that would keep her grounded in something real. Luca studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and told her to come back tomorrow at 6 in the morning, ready to work. And she did. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. For the next 3 months, Tessa Marino lived a life she'd never imagined. She woke before dawn and took the subway to Bay Ridge, arriving at Luca's restaurant while the city was still dark. She learned to make fresh pasta from Luca's head chef, an elderly Sicilian woman who spoke more Italian than English and didn't care about social media. She scrubbed pots, swept floors, took out garbage, served food to customers who sometimes recognized her and whispered but mostly just wanted their meal. It was humbling work, exhausting work, honest work. And for the first time in years, Tessa felt something close to peace. Luca rarely spoke to her directly, but she watched him constantly. She observed how he treated his employees with quiet dignity, how he remembered details about customers' lives, how he commanded respect without demanding it. She saw how people came to him with problems, not just restaurant issues, but life problems, and how he listened carefully before offering advice. She learned that power wasn't about dominance or fear. It was about presence, consistency, and the slow accumulation of trust. But the outside world hadn't forgotten her. Her social media accounts remained frozen in time, the last post still that haunting video. Her follower count was dropping steadily as the algorithm punished her inactivity and people moved on to newer, shinier personalities. Her agent stopped calling. Brand deals evaporated completely. The lease on her Manhattan apartment came due, and she couldn't afford to renew it. She moved into a small studio in Brooklyn, closer to the restaurant, and discovered that life without luxury was actually simpler, cleaner. Some nights, lying in her small bed, she would open her phone and look at her old posts. The person staring back from those carefully filtered photos felt like a stranger, a performance she'd mistaken for identity. Then, on a cold morning in January, something happened that brought everything full circle. Tessa was opening the restaurant with Luca when 3 young men walked in. They were in their early 20s, dressed in designer streetwear, phones out, clearly recording. Influencers. They recognized Tessa immediately. One of them, a cocky kid with a viral TikTok channel, called out to her, his tone mocking. He asked if she was washing dishes now, if this was what happened when you fell off, if she was begging the old man for forgiveness. His friends laughed, their cameras pointed at her, waiting for the breakdown, the viral moment. Tessa felt the old anger rise in her chest, the instinct to defend herself, to snap back, to engage. But then she glanced at Luca, who was calmly hanging up his coat, his expression neutral. She took a breath and did something that shocked even herself. She smiled and told them the restaurant wasn't open yet, but if they wanted to come back for lunch, the pasta was excellent. The young influencer's smile faltered. He'd expected fury, tears, drama, content. Instead, he got quiet dignity. He pushed harder, stepping closer, his phone inches from her face. He asked if the old man had broken her, if she was scared now, if she'd learned her lesson. Before Tessa could respond, Luca's voice cut through the room. He didn't raise his tone, didn't move from where he stood. He simply said that the restaurant was closed and that the young men should leave. The influencer made a critical mistake. Emboldened by his own followers, drunk on his own perceived invincibility, he turned his camera toward Luca and asked if he was the famous dinosaur who couldn't handle the modern world. The temperature in the room dropped. Tessa saw it happen. The shift in Luca's eyes, the subtle straightening of his posture. She'd seen this before in the club, right before everything fell apart. But Luca didn't move toward them. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a single call. Within 5 minutes, 3 police cars arrived outside the restaurant. Within 10 minutes, the young influencers were being escorted out, their phones confiscated as evidence of trespassing and harassment. Within an hour, their social media accounts were suspended for violating multiple terms of service, a process accelerated by connections Luca still maintained in various institutions. The young men learned what Tessa had learned, that real power doesn't announce itself, doesn't perform for cameras, it simply acts. After they were gone, Luca returned to his morning routine as if nothing had happened. But before he headed to the kitchen, he stopped beside Tessa and spoke quietly. He told her that she had done well, that she was learning. Then he said something that stayed with her forever. He said that respect was a language most people had forgotten how to speak, but once you learned it, truly learned it, you could never go back to the noise. Epilogue. 6 months later, Tessa Marino's social media accounts updated for the first time since the infamous video. But the content was different. She posted photos of pasta making, of the restaurant's old brick oven, of the Brooklyn neighborhood at dawn. She shared stories about the regular customers, about learning to cook, about the satisfaction of work that created something tangible. Her captions were longer, more thoughtful, stripped of the hashtags and engagement tricks that had once defined her brand. Her audience, predictably, was divided. Many former followers drifted away, seeking the high-energy chaos they'd signed up for. But slowly, a new audience emerged. People tired of the performance, hungry for something real. Her follower count stabilized, then began to grow again, but differently. Smaller numbers, deeper engagement, real conversations. She never told the full story of what happened in that room during those 3 days. That remained between her and Luca, a private reckoning that didn't need to be commodified. Luca Rinaldi continued running his restaurant, an old man in Brooklyn who most people walked past without a second glance. The younger generation of influencers, the ones who heard whispers of the story, gave his neighborhood a wide berth. They understood, on some primal level, that there were still places in the world where their rules didn't apply. On a spring evening, Tessa was closing the restaurant when an elderly woman came in, one of the regulars who'd known Luca for decades. The woman looked at Tessa and spoke in heavily accented English. Sharing something she said Tessa needed to know. The woman explained that Luca had lost a granddaughter years ago, before he came to America. A young woman about Tessa's age who'd made reckless choices, fallen in with dangerous people, and died before she could be saved. The woman said that when Luca looked at Tessa, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a second chance. Tessa felt tears sting her eyes. She'd spent months wondering why he'd shown her mercy, why he'd let her live, why he'd allowed her to work in his restaurant. She'd assumed it was strategy, or perhaps cruel entertainment, but it was something far simpler, far more human. It was grief, transformed into purpose. That night, Tessa sat in her small Brooklyn apartment and recorded one final video. Not for views, not for validation, but because some stories need to be told. She spoke about the culture of influencer fame, about the emptiness of validation from strangers, about the moment she realized she'd built her entire identity on smoke and mirrors. She talked about respect, about consequences, about the people who still lived by older codes of honor. She said that she'd been given a gift, not forgiveness, but the chance to become someone worth respecting. And she ended with a simple message that before you chase fame, before you cross lines for content, before you treat life like a game, remember that somewhere out there are people who will remind you, gently or otherwise, that actions matter. That respect isn't a trend, it's survival. The video went viral naturally, but this time, Tessa didn't watch the numbers climb. She turned off her phone, made herself a simple dinner, and sat by her window watching Brooklyn's lights flicker in the darkness. Somewhere across the neighborhood, in a small apartment above his restaurant, Luca Rinaldi sat by his own window, a glass of wine in hand, remembering a granddaughter he couldn't save and a young woman he could. The wolves, he thought, could rest tonight, but they would always be watching. If you enjoyed this story of redemption, consequences, and the old world meeting the new, subscribe to the channel for more real, raw, and emotionally powerful tales. These stories don't just entertain, they remind us who we really are when the cameras stop rolling. Hit subscribe and stay for the next chapter. 2 years had passed since the night Tessa Marino slapped Luca Rinaldi in front of 40 witnesses, and the world had continued spinning, indifferent to the small dramas of individual lives. But for those involved, those 2 years had rewritten everything they thought they knew about power, redemption, and what it meant to truly change. Tessa still worked at the restaurant, though her role had evolved. She was no longer just clearing tables and learning pasta recipes. Luca had gradually given her more responsibility, managing reservations, handling supplier relationships, even teaching new hires the standards of service he demanded. She'd become part of the fabric of the place, recognized by regulars not as the fallen influencer, but as the young woman who made sure their favorite table was always available and remembered how they liked their espresso. Her social media presence had transformed into something unrecognizable from her early days. She posted maybe twice a week, mostly photographs of food, neighborhood scenes, small moments of beauty she encountered in daily life. Her captions were thoughtful, sometimes philosophical, often quoting books she was reading or lessons she was learning. Her audience had shrunk to just under 2 million followers, but the engagement was different. Real conversations, genuine connections, people who saw her journey as inspiration rather than entertainment. She'd started taking night classes at a community college, studying business management and Italian language. The irony wasn't lost on her that her parents, immigrants who'd sacrificed everything for her education, were now watching her return to school after building and losing a fortune. But they were proud in a way they'd never been during her influencer peak. Her mother had cried the first time Tessa brought home her report card. Straight A's earned through actual effort, rather than manufactured content. The apartment in Brooklyn had become a home rather than a temporary landing spot. She'd furnished it slowly, carefully, with pieces from thrift stores and neighborhood yard sales. No designer furniture, no Instagram-worthy aesthetic, just a space that felt lived in, comfortable, real. She'd learned to cook beyond the restaurant recipes, hosting small dinners for the few genuine friends she'd maintained or newly made. People who knew her as Tessa, not as the influencer, not as the cautionary tale. But the past still found ways to resurface. One afternoon in late autumn, Tessa was reviewing invoices in the restaurant's small office when her phone buzzed with a notification she'd almost forgotten was possible. A message request on Instagram from someone she didn't follow. Normally she ignored these, the remnants of her old life still occasionally reaching out with business propositions, interview requests, or cruel messages from people who enjoyed watching her fall. This one was different. The account belonged to Marcus Chen, one of the 3 young influencers who'd confronted her in the restaurant 2 years ago. The same cocky kid whose phones had been confiscated, whose accounts had been suspended, who'd learned that morning that cameras didn't make you invincible. The message was surprisingly humble. He said he'd been thinking about that day constantly, that his life had fallen apart after the incident in ways that forced him to reevaluate everything. He'd lost sponsorships, struggled to rebuild his audience, faced mockery from the same community that had once celebrated him. He said he'd watched Tessa's transformation from a distance and wanted to know if she'd be willing to talk, to share how she'd found her way through the wreckage. Tessa stared at the message for a long time. Part of her wanted to delete it, to maintain the boundaries she'd carefully constructed around her new life. But another part remembered the darkness she'd experienced, the terror and confusion, and the unlikely mercy that had given her a second chance. She showed the message to Luca that evening, after the dinner rush had ended, and they were doing the final cleanup. He read it silently, then handed the phone back without comment. But she'd learned to read his silences, the slight movements of his expression that conveyed more than words. He asked her what she wanted to do. Tessa thought about the young woman who'd walked into Club Neon with cameras rolling and ego inflated, who'd believed she was untouchable. She thought about the 3 days in darkness, the slow rebuilding, the countless small humiliations and victories that had brought her to this moment. She told Luca she wanted to meet with Marcus, but only if he came to the restaurant, only if he was willing to work for it. Luca nodded slowly, then said something that surprised her. He said that mercy wasn't something you received once and forgot about. It was a responsibility, a debt you paid forward to others who made the same mistakes you'd made. He said that if she could help this young man avoid some of the pain she'd experienced, that would be a better use of her second chance than simply surviving. The meeting happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, before the restaurant opened. Marcus arrived exactly on time, dressed simply, no cameras, no entourage. He looked different from Tessa's memory, thinner, more serious, the arrogant smile replaced by something more uncertain. They sat at a table near the window, and for 2 hours they talked. Not the performative conversation of their old world, but something real and difficult. Marcus explained how his life had imploded after that morning, the cancelled deals, the online mockery, the realization that the community he'd thought was his family had abandoned him the moment he wasn't useful. He talked about depression, about questioning everything he'd built, about the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose. Tessa listened without judgment, recognizing every beat of his story, because she'd lived her own version. When he finished, she shared her own journey, not the sanitized version she'd posted online, but the raw truth. The fear in that dark room, the shame of realizing how empty her life had been, the slow process of rebuilding an identity not based on validation from strangers. She told him something Luca had taught her, that influence without wisdom was just noise, that respect couldn't be demanded or performed, but only earned through consistent, honest action over time. Marcus asked the question she'd known was coming. How did she live with the guilt, with the knowledge of what she'd done, with the weight of being a public cautionary tale? Tessa looked out the window at Brooklyn moving through its morning rhythm. People heading to work, shopkeepers opening their stores, the ordinary miracle of daily life continuing regardless of individual drama. She told him that guilt was useful only if it changed your behavior. That shame could either destroy you or refine you, depending on what you did with it, that the only way forward was to become someone who would never make those mistakes again, and to help others avoid the same traps. When Marcus left, he thanked her with genuine emotion. He didn't ask for a photo or try to document the meeting. He simply shook her hand and walked out into the morning. Tessa watched him go and felt something shift inside her, a lightening, a sense that maybe the worst of it was truly behind her, that she was no longer defined by her lowest moment but by what she'd chosen to build afterward. That evening, Luca called her into his office, a cramped space behind the kitchen that smelled of old paper and espresso. He poured 2 small glasses of grappa, The strong Italian liquor he saved for special occasions. He told her that he was getting old, that his hands hurt in the mornings, and his energy wasn't what it used to be. He said he'd been thinking about the future of the restaurant, about what would happen when he was gone. Then he said he wanted to make her a partner. Tessa's eyes widened. She started to protest, to say she wasn't ready, that she didn't deserve it. But Luca held up a hand, silencing her gently. He explained that the restaurant had always been more than a business to him. It was a legacy, a piece of the old world preserved in the new, a place where certain values still mattered. He said he'd watched her transformation, not with surprise, but with hope, because he'd gambled that underneath the performance was a person capable of substance. He said he'd been right. The partnership wouldn't be announced publicly, wouldn't be used for marketing or content. It would be real, legal, a commitment to maintaining what he'd built, and to slowly, carefully passing it on to someone who understood why it mattered. Tessa felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but of something more complex. Gratitude, disbelief, the overwhelming recognition that she'd been given something she could never have earned in her old life. She accepted. In the months that followed, Tessa took on more responsibility, learning not just the daily operations, but the deeper relationships that kept the restaurant functioning. She met with the suppliers Luca had worked with for decades, old Italian men who spoke in half English, half Italian, and who tested her before accepting her. She sat in on the weekly card games with Luca's old crew, the men who'd witnessed her worst moment and her redemption, who now nodded to her with something approaching respect. She learned that legacy wasn't about fame or numbers or viral moments. It was about consistency, about showing up day after day, about building something that would outlast you because it was rooted in principles deeper than personal ambition. On a spring evening, almost 3 years to the day after the incident at Club Neon, Tessa was closing the restaurant when she noticed Luca standing at the front window, looking out at the Brooklyn street with an expression she'd never quite seen before. Contemplative, perhaps nostalgic. She approached quietly and stood beside him. He spoke without looking at her, his voice soft. He said that he'd done terrible things in his life, things that still woke him in the night, choices that couldn't be undone or forgiven. He said he'd spent his years in Brooklyn trying to build something good, something clean, as if a restaurant could somehow balance accounts written in blood. He said he didn't know if it worked that way, if redemption was really possible, or just a story people told themselves. Then he looked at her and said that watching her transform had given him something he'd thought was lost. Not forgiveness, but hope. Hope that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to be forever, that the future didn't have to repeat the past. Tessa didn't know what to say. She simply reached out and took his hand, the hand of the man who terrified her, taught her, saved her, and trusted her. They stood together in the window as the Brooklyn evening deepened into night. Two people carrying the weight of their choices, building something together that might outlast them both. Outside, the world continued its endless scroll, chasing the next viral moment, the next scandal, the next manufactured drama. But inside that small restaurant, in the space between past and future, something quieter and more enduring had taken root. Legacy, it turned out, wasn't loud. It was just this: 2 people, a handshake, and the promise to do better tomorrow than yesterday. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that dig beneath the surface, that explore what happens after the cameras stop rolling and real life begins. These are the stories that matter, the ones that remind us who we can become. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapter.